Southeast Asia has become the hotbed for innovation, for digital growth. In fact, by 2025, the region is expected to be among the top 5 digital economies in the world. But there is a slight problem. You can't have a digital economy without having cybersecurity. And the problem really lies with Southeast Asian economies themselves. They're not spending nearly enough to protect their digital transformation. In fact, the region is at risk of facing cyber attacks amounting to an estimated $750 billion. That's a huge amount. So why does the region find itself in that position? What needs to be done? How should your digital strategy look like? That's why Naveen is here. So Naveen, let's start it going by addressing why the vulnerability. Why is the region in this position?
Yeah, so there's a general tendency to want to add connections, which I think is absolutely the right thing to do. We add the number of connections, we add the number of devices, we add the number of users. Every connection that gets added is directly proportional to GDP growth, right? So the more connections you add, the more GDP growth you will generate. And there's a direct link being made. It's an academically robust, and it works every single time. The problem is the rate of growth is so high, but the rate of growth of security, of spending of security, is not as high, which is leaving a bit of a chasm. It's leaving a bit of a gap in terms of things that you can exploit. So if you're a bad guy working in this space, you can see this trend clearly. We keep adding sensors, we keep adding networks, we keep adding devices, but then we're not spending enough to kind of keep up with it. And therefore, there's an opportunity, if you're a hacker, to go out there and take advantage of that opportunity. ASEAN is particularly at risk because ASEAN spends only 0.08% of GDP on cybersecurity. The best in class is Israel, which spends 0.36% of GDP. So ASEAN is spending about 3 to 4 times lower than best in class. Sort of the world average would be around the 0.15, 1.16% of GDP. So clearly it's underspending, and that's a challenge because, yes, spending is one issue, and I do want to highlight on that, but it's more than just spending as well. There's lots of other issues around it, but definitely spending is one of the biggest issues.
Okay, so spending is one issue. What is it? Complacency? A lack of talent? A lack of, I guess, appreciation for the losses that can be helped?
Yeah, I mean, there are many studies on this that say, when you're attacked, we'll just patch it and fix it, and then it doesn't cost that much. But one of the things actually I heard on the previous panelist who was talking about this is when your data gets breached, your customers lose trust in your organization. Whether your organization is a small, medium enterprise, whether you are a large corporate, or whether you are a government entrusted with citizen data, if you lose trust, you basically don't go back to the organization. And so there's a loss of market. It's directly proportional to market capitalization for publicly listed companies. If you're a small, medium enterprise, it could be devastating for the growth of the small and medium enterprise. And if it's government, I could ask people in the audience, what would you feel like if all your government data was taken out and sold on the dark web? That would be pretty catastrophic on a country level. So the general feeling is that, if I get hacked, I'll patch it and fix it. But people don't think about the loss of trust. The trust is a big element, and it's sometimes unquantifiable. So there's a general sense of let me try and see how far I can go without spending as much as I need to, and then I'll deal with the issue when it happens, which is maybe not the right way of doing things.
Give us a sense of the kind of hacking that happens. I mean, increasingly we're talking about state-backed hacking. Is that the trend that comes to mind?
The one that we're most concerned about at Cisco is there's the growth in sort of coalitions of hackers that are operating as an organization, right? So there is organized crime out there, and that's probably the majority of the major threats out there. So organized crime syndicates actually are the biggest challenge. People like to talk about state-sponsored cyber terrorism, and the news picks up that a lot. I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but it's not the biggest driver of it. And people also like to talk about the sort of the 17-year-old kid in the garage in his boxer shorts, hacking into some other company. That's a really minority. It's like a tiny, tiny part of the overall issue. So the issue is really are the growing coalitions of cyber organizations, and those are the reason why they're successful is because they come together. And so one of the things that we are a strong proponent of is why can't the organizations that are being attacked come together as well? Why do we operate in silos? Why do we operate as individuals when clearly, the bad actors are coming together as a larger force and attacking us?
But the issue really is trust. Why should I be trusting you with my data and likewise vice versa?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And there's two things to address that, right? One is a lot of education is needed. So education to the mass public, education to government, education to the boards of companies. Many of you here are boards of companies or are CEOs or CXOs. Education is a key factor. The second thing is we need to classify the difference between sharing data and sharing intelligence. So there's a very fundamental difference. When you share data, in many countries that's could be illegal because you're breaching maybe personal or corporate data. We're talking about sharing threat intelligence. Threat intelligence is something that is what you learned from a cyber attack. What you learn from a cyber attack is like patterns in the malware that you've seen, or how the malware moves through the network into your device. That is intelligence, and that intelligence can be shared without giving up any company or personal specific data.
I want to get a sense of how big and how critical the problem really is. I know that during the Trump-Kim summit in Singapore received about 40,000 cyber attacks in the span of 21 hours. I thought it was quite a large number, but Naveen says that's very small.
It sounds small to me. I'm not sure where your source was, but it was.
I'm a journalist.
But just to give you a sense, we have, Cisco tracks 20 billion threats a day, right? 20 billion. So 41,000 in comparison to 20 billion threats a day seems small. But if you just put that in context, 20 billion threats a day. There are do you know how many Google searches there are a day? There are 6.7 billion Google searches a day worldwide. So we track 20 billion, 3 times the number of Google searches we track in threats per day, and we block them. So most of it is done through AI machine learning algorithms that can be blocked, and then there's a very small minority of threats that go to a highly qualified team of really hardcore hacking kind of specialists who will then deal with those manually, right? You can't block 20 billion threats a day with human beings. So that's why I said it seems small, because in comparison globally, we block 20 billion threats a day. Big events typically do that. If you go to you go to the Olympics, or you go to the World Cup, or these events offer free Wi-Fi, and everything kind of gets logged on, and people try to attack the site. So it's not uncommon to be attacked during big events, and I think Singapore as a country is very well prepared to deal with those kinds of things.
Okay, so Singapore's well prepared, but earlier you talked about how the region as a whole is underspending. Who's underspending the most?
So the largest underspenders are coming from, primarily in Indonesia. We've seen, if you compare Indonesia's spending to the rest of the ASEAN countries, Indonesia should, according to our numbers, just to get to average, should be spending another $24 billion between now and 2025 on cybersecurity. The other countries that are in there, and they're all hover around the sort of $9 to $10 billion range. So Malaysia's at 9.1 billion, Thailand at 9.1, Philippines at 8.8, and then in total the rest of ASEAN is like another 8 or 9 billion. So there's a total underspend of about $67 billion, but that's just to get to average spend. If you want to get to best in class, which is Israel, then we're talking about another $170 billion of spend. So the question is, where is that going to get funded from? It's not coming from raising taxes. No one should be doing that, right? It's not the point. The point is, can we find ways in which to fund the underspending? And I think there are ways to do that.
What are the risks then? It does look like countries are not making it a priority to spend on.
Yeah, the spending, like I said, is one thing. What I'm particularly worried about is that if you look at the 10 countries across ASEAN, there are, if you look at the EU, for example, there is progress been made on cybersecurity policy in the EU. In ASEAN operates not as they don't have the EU sort of structure, so every country has its own say in terms of how to implement policy or legislation. So the challenge in ASEAN is that there are 10 countries. Each country has to develop its own sort of national strategy for cybersecurity, and that needs sort of a multi-agency approach. And then secondly, you need sector-level dialogues. You need financial services, transportation, consumer goods. They all need to kind of have sector-level dialogues. Once you've done the national strategy, you need to translate that into cybersecurity strategy. Cybersecurity strategy, there are currently only 2 countries that have cybersecurity strategies in place, policies in place, which are Singapore and Vietnam. And then once you've got policy, you can actually enact law. And law, there are 2 types of laws. There's cybersecurity law and there's cybercrime law. If there's a breach, currently, in many countries, there's no cybersecurity law that you can even go ahead and sue someone on. Whereas there is measures in place to deal with cybercrime, because that's dealt with as a criminal activity. And then finally, underpinning all of this are 4 things. So information sharing, which we talked about. Secondly, is standards adoption. Thirdly, we need to build more awareness around the issue of cybersecurity in ASEAN. And fourthly, capacity and capability building. So education, workforce needs to be developed, and we need to address the skills gap. There's not enough skills in the space. So it's a lot to do in 10 countries that each have their own way of doing things. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for policymakers to work on that.
Let's pick up on the skills gap. How can that be addressed? Because both the private and the public sector can do this together.
Yeah. So skills gap can be addressed in many ways. I mean, it's really a supply-driven issue. So supply of labor is a big issue. We found that in Malaysia, there are 4,000 cybersecurity professionals by 2020. That's a huge number to train. So how do you get those in? Now, the first thing is you can address it by bringing cybersecurity as a topic to discuss even during K-12. So those that have kids, K-12, I know my kids are very aware that they don't do things on the internet that maybe adults would. Like, they would be very careful about sharing their information because they've been trained at a very early age. Then when you get to the university goers, there's opportunities to learn polytechnics, universities in a trade environment. You can learn about cybersecurity and go into the profession. Then there's the segment of going into national service military, where there are some countries that are adopting cybersecurity as a way to kind of, as a path in for military service. And then there's kind of the mid-career professionals, right, that are, sort of in making transitions as the digital economy impacts them, AI automation impacts. At Cisco, and prior to that as a consultant to boards, is I find that boards of companies typically don't know the right question to ask on what is the security posture of a company. Typically the questions tend to be fairly closed-ended, as in yes/no answers. Are we secure? Have we spent the budget? What do you look? What are some of what are the top 2 issues you're worried about? These are sort of restrictive questions. What I would like to see is more open-ended questions, asking about how much of our business is on the cloud, how much of our business is stored on local servers.
What is the right answer?
Well, I mean, the thing is, there is no right answer. It depends on the company's strategies. But the good thing is that every business and every board that I've interacted with anyway over the years are very smart, critical thinkers. And having the dialogue is actually more important than having the right answer, because having the right dialogue and escalating it to the board is absolutely the right thing to do. Now, if I was a CISO, as in a Chief Information Security Officer, I wouldn't want every single one of the attacks to go, to the board, because you don't want that. You don't want that everything can be dealt with on an operational level. But there are more systemic policy questions that you need help from the board, and the board typically is very good at solving those problems for you and asking the right questions to help you as a CISO or a CIO to keep the company secure.
Now, increasingly, we're, I guess, using cloud. How should security be, or how should security look like, since there's so much reliance on it, and how secure is it?
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's not just about cloud, it's about the Internet of Things, or the Internet of Everything, or whatever you want to call it. Everything that gets added onto the Internet is a potential threat. I mean, it's a potential opportunity, but it's also a threat, right? So if you are putting data on the cloud, or if you're adding a sensor to your manufacturing floor, how do you protect it? Now, the way we believe, or I believe, that is the right way to protect it is you need protection at multi-layers, right? It starts with the network. The network, to me, is the most ultimate layer to kind of protect. Every single packet of data could contain malware. Now, I don't know if you know this, but 70 to 80% of the traffic on the internet, on any corporate network, is actually encrypted. Malware travel, the hackers have figured that out, right? Mm-hmm. So they put malware in encrypted traffic. So how do you find malware in encrypted traffic without decrypting it? Because you can't decrypt encrypted traffic. It's illegal in many countries. So we've actually developed that technology to find malware in encrypted traffic without decrypting it. It took us about 3 years, published the patents. We've now published a white paper to show everyone how to do it, and it's done at line speed. So you could actually be literally on a video call, and what happens is packets of data flow through your network. Those packets, if it's got the shape of a certain malware object, or if it's traveling through the network in a certain way that we've identified as suspicious, we would isolate that packet, we would put it in a sandbox, explode it, look for malware, and if the malware is there, we would report it, and we would also isolate it, and the remaining packets we would put back in line and send it back on its way. So it's a very kind of real-time thing to kind of find malware in encrypted traffic that doesn't break any national laws. And a lot of companies nowadays just use technology that samples. So they'll find a stream of data, and they'll take a sample, and they go, oh, that one's okay, so there's no malware, so your stream is okay. That's a mistake, because there could be malware in the data. You need to sample every single packet of data. So if you've got data on the cloud, you've got data on sensors, data on your network, you need to basically track the malware and use cybersecurity at the network layer. I think that's probably the best way to do it.
Earlier we talked about how governments can take steps. How secure are companies? Because I think you've got to differentiate perhaps between technology companies, which are probably more savvy when it comes to protecting themselves, versus maybe companies in the manufacturing sector. Talk to us about what you're seeing.
Yeah, so I mean, I've seen, and to no offense to anyone in the room, I have seen the banks and the telcos are really furthest ahead in this. Fantastic. I think they recognize that this is a challenge. They take a lot of steps to kind of protect themselves. Of course, more could be done, right? There are some sectors, though, that could do a little bit more. So, for example, I am keen to see a lot more investment going into protection of networks in manufacturing environments, and this is a very difficult problem. It's not because the companies don't recognize the need. It's because it requires a lot of capex. And that capex typically isn't there, So when you have a lot of legacy equipment, pumps, compressors, etc., that are sometimes working on operating systems that are very outdated, but somehow connected to your central control room. And I was a chemical engineer. I grew up in a manufacturing environment. I know that this equipment exists. The problem is you can't upgrade everything at the same time, and there's lots of equipment on the network in the manufacturing environment, so it takes time. So I would urge manufacturers particularly to look at their networks to make sure that they design in security into their network in the manufacturing floor.
Just a reminder that you can ask questions, and that's via the app, so feel free to send those questions my way. There's one question here. Jobs are developing quickly into new tasks. We talked about how you need to develop talent. Could you share about your vision regarding the education needed in colleges and universities for the future? What do you suggest for students in particular?
Yeah, so we're doing a really broad-ranging study right now across 10 countries in ASEAN to look at the impact of AI automation on jobs specifically. And everyone talks about it. Everyone says it's going to impact jobs. No one puts a number out there, right? So we're actually going to go and put out a number pretty soon. We'll announce it in mid-September. The number will say not just where the jobs are going to be lost, but they're also going to, the traditional economic theory is that when you have productivity savings in one area because of technology, you have savings, and the savings you invest in another area. When you invest in another area, you generate jobs, right? So there's loss of jobs, there's creation of jobs, and then as you start to grow the new industries come up and new jobs are created, and then there's more productivity savings, and then there's a cycle. So we're doing a multi-layered kind of model. It's very analytical, it's very quantitative, covers 10 countries, and we will be able to predict by 2028 where are the jobs going to be lost, where are the jobs going to be created, by country, by industry sector, and by job function. We're right now working through the details of that, but I got to say, things that require, so we're looking at tasks, things that require lifting, moving, those kind of physical activities, a lot of those activities will be affected by automation. Now, if I look at ASEAN, there's a lot of agriculture, right? And there's a lot of productivity gains that should be made in agriculture. Automation will affect agriculture in a big way. So we need to figure out what to do about that. That's one emerging finding we're seeing. Like I said, the final results were released in September, but we need to think about how we can support the jobs that will be affected in the agriculture space in ASEAN.